Asahi Newsreels, The Showa Years, DVD Series Review. Right, so just to clarify, this is not a movie review. I'm expanding my game now and have rented a whole set of DVDs and worked my way through them, and this is a review of the DVD set. This is a series of 8, I think it was 8 DVDs, comprising the Asahi Newsreels series. So this is something I rented when I was in Japan. And these are a collection of newsreels compiled by Asahi, which is a famous somewhat left-leaning newspaper in Japan. It's one of the 2 main newspapers in Japan. And I didn't know this, but apparently they produced newsreels as well. And some of these newsreels were collected on DVD, and you could actually rent these at the local DVD rental shop. Now, why would anyone do this? Well, in my case, I had kind of 2 reasons. One, I've been meaning for a long time to get more involved in Japanese media, just as part of my Japanese language studies. So I wanted to watch more Japanese TV, watch more Japanese movies, watch more DVD series, and also I figured watching all these newsreels would help me learn some Japanese history. I've been trying to find out more about Japanese history recently. So that's my excuse for renting them. Now, that's just me. I mean, why anyone else would have rented these, I don't know. But yeah, I guess some people might like newsreels. I'm not gonna lie and say that these were fascinating to watch. These were a little bit boring to watch at times. Some of the clips were more interesting than others. It was largely broccoli, in that it was something I was doing because it was good for me, not because it was all that entertaining. And yet, I don't know, sometimes it could be pretty interesting. I found more often than not, I mean, it was a series of 8 DVDs box set, so in quite a few hours here. I didn't watch it all in one night, over a series of nights. It was like going to the gym. Like, the worst thing about it was just kind of psyching myself up to watch it. But by the time I pressed play, I usually just kind of got sucked in by the images, and would more often than not have a good time. I mean, it wasn't like watching Star Wars or anything, but it was entertaining enough. Okay, so some background here. It's titled The Showa Years. Now, in Japan, like in England, they name eras after the emperor. So, you know, like in England, they have the Victorian era, the Elizabethan era. In Japan, they have a similar thing, but they name stuff after the emperor. So this is named after the Showa emperor. Now, the Showa emperor reigned from 1926 to 1989. Which includes World War II, right? So I guess, you know, like in America or something, and then maybe that's the immediate association with the Showa Emperor is World War II. Except we don't call him the Showa Emperor in America, do we? We call him Emperor Hirohito. Showa, I think each emperor kind of takes on a ceremonial name when they become emperor. But, you know, the guy was alive all the way up until 1989. And so most Japanese, when you say the word Showa to them, they have the association of, you know, like the 50s and the 60s and the economic boom in the 70s. And it's almost, Showa is almost interchangeable with the word nostalgia, in that these were a lot of periods that a lot of particularly older Japanese people have nostalgia for, you know, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the word Showa is more associated in Japanese with the post-war years. At least that was my impression living there. Excuse me, I'm going to shift my seat here. It's still getting comfortable in the new apartment, so apologies if I'm having trouble positioning myself. Yeah, This series starts off in 1955 and goes all the way to 1979, which surprised me because I thought, isn't 1955 the year newsreels were dying out? Right? Because like newsreels were associated with, you know, like the before television, the 30s and 40s. And then by 50s, television was coming into being a thing, and there weren't any more newsreels left. Somebody actually commented on my original blog review of this with some helpful information, which says, you know, the whole thing about newsreels dying out in the 50s, that was an American thing. That wasn't true in all countries. He said in a number of countries, Japan included, these newsreels, which would play in the movie theaters, continued through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What does he say? I think in Britain, the last one was 1981. I think in Japan they stopped around the same time. Also, he gives me some helpful information. The reason that there weren't a lot of Showa newsreels before this period is because, well, I guess in the 1930s, Asahi and the Daily Yomiuri, the other newspaper, competed to produce newsreels. But apparently most of those are lost now and are very rare. And then during the war years, the Japanese government just took over it. So the Asahi newsreels, yeah, I guess that's why they start in 1955. And go all the way up to 1979 in this collection. Except for the last 3 years, it's all in black and white. And then it starts becoming in color 76, 77, 78, 79. Now, my Japanese, I've forgotten a lot now, but even at the height, my Japanese was about maybe an upper intermediate level. I never really quite broke through that barrier into advanced Japanese. So a lot of this I didn't understand. But I understood some of it. I mean, sometimes the visuals were self-apparent. Yeah, I felt at least like I was able to get some stuff out of this. The newsreels have only about 5 or 6 news stories from each year. And of those, about half of them are soft human interest stories or sports news. So there's really only about 3 hard news stories from each year, which must mean that they're edited to produce like this collection. I'm sure the complete collection from each year must be much longer. The audio track never quite syncs up with the lip movements through all of these DVD series. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, was this just the way that the newsreels were produced for 30 years? Or probably more likely, there's just some problem with the DVD set. I don't know, someone got careless syncing up the audio, but it's a bit odd. I'm not going to go through everything here because there was like 8 DVD discs here. So there was a lot of news I watched. And it took me 2 months to work through the whole thing. I mean, granted, that was kind of, some of that was being lazy. There was a lot of interesting stuff in here. Some of the stuff I had already known about, but you know, it always helps to put a visual to book knowledge. For example, Tokyo Underworld, a book I reviewed before on this channel, had talked about things like the Lockheed bribery scandal in the 1970s, really interesting, or the Ricky Dozan pro wrestler craze in the 1950s, another thing that's really interesting. And I'm not going to go into that. You can look that kind of stuff up on Wikipedia. But that stuff did pop up in these newsreel DVDs. Also, another Japanese movie I reviewed, Always, which was kind of a nostalgic look back at the 1950s. In that movie, it was a really big deal when the first houses on the block got their first electric appliances, the refrigerator, the washing machines, the television. And this comes through in the newsreels. They make a big deal about the first televisions and refrigerators and washing machines getting acquired in homes. And then we get into the 1960s, and there's the student movement in Japan, the student protest movement. Now, this is something that, again, I've talked about at length before on this channel in other videos, so I'm not going to rehash it too much, other than to say, even though I knew all the history behind the Japanese student protest movement, it was still just fascinating to watch and to see those visuals. Now, it was especially interesting because the years I was in Japan, and I think most of the years since then, Japan has been very peaceful and quiet domestically. You know, like no major protests, no big student activism on campuses. Young people didn't seem to be politically interested at all when I was in Japan. So it was quite interesting watching these clips from the 60s and 70s with these students all riled up and protesting and all this, student riots and stuff like that. And you think, this is Japan? This is nothing like the Japan I know. But yeah, I guess that's the way things are, right? Things change. Within a generation, the character of a country can completely change. But I mean, yeah, it was completely different to the time I was living in Japan, this era of student activism and student protest. Also in the newsreels, about once a year, there would be some sort of clip about a natural disaster. Like a typhoon that had hit or a winter blizzard that had hit. I'm sure this was all big news at the time, but like 40 years afterwards, nobody cares about the winter blizzard, or at least I don't. I don't know, maybe somebody does. I would have been quite happy if they had switched that out for another clip, but I don't know, maybe that's just me. Also, I'm not a sports fan, so all the old sports news in these newsreels I was quite bored by. I did learn some interesting stuff though. For example, I learned that there was a plane crash in Oita Prefecture in 1964, and I was living in Oita Prefecture at that time. So I was like, oh, right, I never knew that. I mean, interesting. It's one of those things I guess you would never know unless you watch old newsreels. Also, I learned that the first sitting U.S. president to visit Japan, I believe ever, was Gerald R. Ford. Way back in the 1970s, the first U.S. president to visit Japan while he was president, which is interesting. Interesting for me because Gerald R. Ford is actually from my hometown, so I thought, oh, interesting. The newsreels in the 60s and 70s are, changing topics here. Another topic. As we get into the 60s and 70s, a common theme that's coming up in these newsreels is how crowded Tokyo is getting. I mean, I guess Tokyo's always been a big city, but there must have been some boom in the 60s and 70s. And there's all these images of people fighting for trains. It looked even worse than the Tokyo I remembered. I only spent a handful of days in Tokyo. And I remember fighting for space on the train to be a little bit disconcerting. But I don't remember being nearly as bad as the images portrayed in these newsreels from the 60s and 70s. So I don't know if maybe they had done something to ease the congestion since then, or I don't know. Another note of interest, as you're watching these newsreels, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there's all this talk about the industrial boom in Japan, and how all these factories are getting built and everything, and it's really with an optimistic tone, yes, we Japanese are rebuilding ourselves. And then all of a sudden by the 1970s, there's all these gloom and doom stories about pollution that are appearing in the newsreels. And so it's interesting kind of seeing the first one and then the second one. And in retrospect, it's easy to see that coming. You're watching the clips from the 50s and 60s about how happy they are with all the factories, and you're thinking, this is ironic. Something's going to change by the 70s. Yeah, and sure enough. And speaking of irony, one last note to end on. The whole series ends with the Prime Minister of Japan, who was Minister Fukuda at the time, visiting Iran in 1978 and getting his picture taking with the Shah. And assuming I understood the Japanese commentary correctly, there was some bland commentary about what an impressive guy the Shah is and how peaceful and pleasant Iran is. And you kind of think, oh, 1978, the irony. They have no idea what's coming. And that's where the series ends. So, yeah, I don't know how long the newsreels continued in Japan, but as far as the DVD series, they just ended at 1979. So, yeah, there were some parts of this I understood better than others. Some of the political stuff, like the debating in parliaments, was just largely incomprehensible to me. I mean, I could see that there were people yelling at each other in the parliament, but that was about it. Some of this other stuff I picked up on better. But yeah, if you're, I don't know if I'd recommend this, to be honest, unless you're a geek like I am. And then yeah, maybe.